Hey guys, so today's just gonna be a quick one. I'm gonna be teaching you a technique first, and then I'm gonna show you how to implement it into your general compositions, how the masters used it, how you can, take that and put into your own work. It's gonna be fun. Hope you learned something. Let's get right into it. So as you can see, this is a painting that I made, and it has a very good sense of purpose and subject, and the subject is obviously the person sitting right here, and the arm especially. And the way that you make the thing look like it's emanating light is by doing this. It's very simply just having a lot of contrast and then escaping values of the light. So what that looks like in application rather than theory is that you have a dark section and then you have a light section. And the dark consumes the light. And you can see that it already has some sense of glowing to it, but it doesn't quite look like it's actually emanating any sort of light. And the way that you do that is by softening the edge between the dark and the light. As you see, as the edge gets a little bit softer, it looks like it's radiating a little bit of its value. And this is a really, really good trick to learn because it makes your paintings look a lot more ethereal and a lot more beautiful a lot of the time. And one of the main reasons for that is when you're making your subject, you always want to have your subject be in the light because that's where the eye is drawn. And when you bring the entire composition to one point of light, then the sense of purpose is a lot more stronger and people will aesthetically and emotionally connect to it a lot further. Now, one thing that's interesting about this whole light trick is that you have to be very sparse with it. If you have a composition and you have a lot of pocketed light sections that all glow, a lot of different shapes that are, let's say, super bright, then what's going to happen is that they're each fighting for your attention. And that's going to become a lot more confusing for the viewer. Now, one thing that you can do is that you can pocket in all of the little light shapes into one little section. So you can have a composition, for example, that holds all the light sections in this little area. And then the rest of it's just all dark. And if you do that, then it gives the composition a sense of organization. And when your composition looks organized yet accidental at the same time, as if you weren't posing it too much to make it too contrived or, forced, then, but it's also balanced with some form of thought and purpose, then you get a good aesthetic connection between the viewer and the painting. Now you can see outside of my work, artists are using this trick all the time. So Sargent, for example, even when he was just doing his charcoal portraits, he'd always make his sitters be in the light. And this one doesn't look like it's glowing as much because all of his edges are hard from the light to the dark, but it still has that sense of really, really brightness. And the way that he did that is that he made the dark so dark because you cannot go any whiter than the white of the page, but to make the lights look really, really light, you make the darks really, really dark because values are all relative. You can see in any of his charcoal portraits, he never puts the subject in the dark. It's always in the light. You can see even in this photograph, the reason why it looks like it's glowing a little bit is because it has the soft edges around the light. This is a really good example. So you can see that although these edges look hard, if you got up close to it, they wouldn't be hard edges, they're soft edges. And when you have that softness, it gives this sense of atmosphere. Because the way that reality actually works is that between you and an object, there is a lot of particles of air, and the further away that something gets, the more airy it gets, the softer the edges get, and the lighter the values become. So you can see that when you're looking at mountains up in, let's say you live in Colorado or something like that, if you look at the mountain ranges, they're always really, really blue, really, really light, and the deviation, the discrimination between the actual mountains and the sky, the edges between two objects, is really indeterminate. So if you make everything really light, everything really blue, if you're painting, obviously not in charcoal or something, but if you make everything bluer, lighter, and softer edges, then it gives a sense of depth and atmosphere to your paintings. And if you can take that one trick that works miles and miles away as far as mountains goes, and you implement it into your portraits, let's say, where it's really, really close to you, then what's going to happen is that you're going to be accentuating a subtle dynamic in reality. And when you can accentuate something that already exists, that people have seen but they don't really know where before, then you're really getting to this interesting part of art that makes your paintings unique and it stands out across the rest of experiences that people have in reality. So in order to get this good sense of light that the masters always had, you need to make sure that your foundation that you're working with is strong. So if you pick up a picture and there's not a large deviation between the light shapes and the dark shapes like this, then it doesn't matter how hard you work at it, you're fighting a losing battle. You can still make it look better, of course, you can make the reference look better, but you're not working with the best materials that you could have been otherwise. So I would suggest if you're going to be making a painting and you're trying to have a good sense of light, which is what the masters were always good at achieving, lights and darks, right? Then what you should do is that you should take your picture, if you're working from a photographic reference, during a time of day like golden hour or any other day where there's not clouds or anything obscuring and softening the light, and you want very direct lighting which divides the forms of the face and the structure. So for example, in Sargent, whenever he was doing portraits, and it was no different for if he was painting in a hotel room, if he was painting a porch, didn't matter the subject matter. He'd always have a strong sense of light and dark. You can see that this is very, very light, this is much darker. And that strong deviation between the lights and the darks always makes the quality of your paintings look a lot better. If he had sat his model in lighting that was overall very soft, it wouldn't have looked as good painting-wise. And even Sargent didn't work from perfect lighting, of course. We know that he manufactured a lot of the stuff that he was making. This drawing, for example, I'm sure that the background wasn't as dark as this actually was, but he darkened up the background, he softened the edges, and he probably made the face even brighter than it actually was. And by doing that, what he did is that he created a sense of ambiance and this presence that this figure has. And a lot of masters do that extremely well, and Sargent's no difference. So if you can get this very strong sense of dark, very strong sense of light, and then you can soften up the edges, it creates this really, really good vision for your piece. You can see he's doing the same thing here. Light, dark, soft edges. Light, dark, and then this one looks crisper. So this is where it gets into style or whatever you're feeling for that particular painting. But you can decide what you like and dislike, obviously. If you like a strong sense of light, but you want it to still look like it's HD, it's 4K, unlike something like this, where it looks a little bit softer and more gentle, then you can go down the route. But to know what causes what is really, really important in art. And a lot of the time, it's very difficult, and you have to learn about yourself. You see something and it looks a certain way, but you have to really start investigating and breaking down how that looks and why it looks the way that it looks. And that's a lot of people have to do that by themselves, and actually gets a shame. So what I'm trying to do here is actually break down what I've learned and put it forth for you guys, so you don't have to spend as much time thinking about these things and just get to painting instead. Now, another cool thing that he would do with his shadows is that not only would he darken up the shadows, make them darker than they actually were value-wise, but he would also omit a lot of the details. In fact, he said, draw the things seen with the keenest point and let the things unseen fuse into adjoining tones. And that all sounds very poetic and beautiful and all this other stuff because, people back then would speak like that. But what it actually means is that in the light, what can be seen, you should make it crisper, you should make it a little more detailed and pronounced. While in the shadows, you should lose a lot of the edges. And you can see that he follows his own advice extremely clearly. Right in the shadow of this hair, you don't see a lot of detail, even though it's hair, and hair is inherently a very textile kind of thing. And there's a lot of, shines, and there's pieces and strands and all this other complexity. He omits all of that, and it's really just a strong, light shade. And it gives this lack of detail in the shadows, gives that airy quality as well, gives that sense of atmosphere. And it's really accentuating, again, something that you see in reality all the time. If you wake up in the middle of the night and you look around your room, you're not going to see that much detail. And if you can represent that in your paintings, then it's a strong thing to have in your arsenal. I mean, you can even see in comic books, and this is something by Frazetta, you can make the same sense of light and purpose using ink, in a completely different style. Sargent was more fine art. Obviously, this is more comic and illustrative work. But they're still using the sense of really, really strong dark, and in fact, so strong dark and so undetailed that it's just pitch black. And they're using this really, really bright sense of white so that you know what's important in the painting. And a lot of the time, visual ambiguity, where things are confusing, is always because people don't know how to use their values correctly, right? And you can see that even Frazetta here, he was aware of that, of the no detail and the darks thing as well. you can see that almost all of his darks do not have a lot of detail in them. This is a great example of that as well. Just super, super dark, and then not a lot of detail, some stars maybe, so it doesn't look completely empty. And then you have detail in the light, same sort of thing. And a thing that a lot of artists do too, and this is an interesting thing, it might be besides the topic, but it's still relevant, is that they'll divide the canvas up into unequal parts as far as the horizon line is concerned. So humans naturally like the thirds as a compositional tool, but it's not really that strict. They also like the golden ratio. I'm sure a lot of you know that. It's just the ratio that's found all over nature between flowers to shells to the way that galaxies unfold. It's just a natural law, and it's a very aesthetic law because it's a very practical ratio to have biologically. But the point is, when we see it visually, we find it attractive because biologically it's a very useful thing to have up your arsenal. So if you see in paintings, a lot of the paintings are divided up into thirds, where a third of it's light, 2/3 of it's black, you know, et cetera, in a lot of other circumstances. Like it can also happen in curves, where the curve goes around the way that the composition is split up. And when you do that, and you have an unequal distribution of light and dark, then it looks a lot more aesthetic as well. And I would suggest thinking about that for your compositions. You can even see in Sargent, a lot of his famous work, most of it is black, and only a tiny proportion of it is light. You can see that. Most of it's dark, a little bit of it's light. And you have to think about how much light you're using, where you're using it, how you're using it. And all of that really affects the way that the viewer interprets and experiences your art. If everything's in the light, then nothing's in the light. And if everything's in the dark, nothing's in the dark. It's the same sort of thing. I mean, paintings are very relative. And any sense of too much balance, in the sense of it's completely half and half, it's not going to look very aesthetic. Or too much of one thing is not going to look very aesthetic. But it's an important, you have to, it's more of a feeling-based thing. If you're creating a composition, and this feels like the right amount of light, and it looks better than some other thumbnails that you created, other value distributions that you created, then go with it, even if it breaks an art rule. But if you feel connected to it, then it's a high probability that other people will feel connected to it as well, because you're using the same perceptual systems that they are fundamentally and biologically, right? I mean, you can even see here, almost all of it is dark, a little bit of it is white, you know. And this is like the basic, this is composition 101, put your subject in the light. This is an example of a painting where most of it's actually in the light, some of it's in the dark. But you can see that even here, where he's using his sparse darks is where the subject is. The darkest part in the painting is right in the hair, and that leads the eye to the face, right? Again, most of it's in the light, some of it's in the dark. Versus most of it's in the dark, some of it's in the light, right? But you want that disbalance, and it looks a lot more visually appealing because of that. This is actually a perfect example, this painting right here, of the golden ratio and how Sargent actually, whether he knowingly did it or not, was doing it. So, go like that. And the golden ratio goes something similar to that, something like, you know, a giant spiral, but most of the spiral is in the larger portion, the smaller part of the spiral is in the, you know, smaller section. And you can see even in Sargent's work here, it has this sense of direction through it. And 2/3 of it's black, and then 1/3 of it is white. And that kind of disbalance, using your lights and darks, really, really helps. Again, most of it's in the dark, some of it's in the light, right? This is where it's getting to the point. I actually saw this painting in person, and you could not see anything except for the face. And this is the point where you're taking it a little too extreme, at least in my opinion. And that's the reason I think that this is one of his less famous works. The work on the face is absolutely gorgeous and masterful. But the problem with the painting is that it's disbalanced to such an extent that it's unaesthetic. If he had made just a little bit more in the light, if he had had some more interest in the painting, then it would have been a much better painting, in my opinion. Like for this is a much more famous painting that he's made. A lot of you have probably seen it before. And the reason for that, I think, is that there's more light in it, but it's not so much light that it becomes unpleasant. So you have a lot of interest in the dress, which has a lot of light. And then you also have external objects other than the figures, which your eye can wander around and glance at, and it kind of contextualizes the whole point of the image. It's not just about them, it's about their environment, their wealth, their clothing. It's, you know what I mean? So the portrait, which is the subject usually, the person or the people, That's the most prime important part. But how do you supplement that part with actual objects, your abstraction of lighting, all these other things? These are things that you want to be thinking about when you're taking your references or working from models or posing the painting at all. And art's a very fine line of, and it's a very soft thing too. It's extremely hard to quantify, to say do this in said situation, right? But there are general rules, like have a disbalance of light but not too much, have a good distribution of values, a smart distribution of values, use a strong stroke, for example, all these other things that will help you along the way in creating better paintings. But at the end of the day, it's your own journey, and you should really be responding primarily to your emotional response. If you feel like something is correct and all the other things that you've tried feel less correct, even though they're supported by known principles of art, then go with your instincts. Absolutely go with your instincts. And that's what art is all about. It's not about trusting your mind, it's about trusting your heart and trusting your soul. And that's one of the most beautiful parts of it. So I hope you guys learned something today. I hope you guys have a great day and go make something beautiful. See you later.